In Module 9, we're going to be looking at some art of the 1600s, which has collectively been given the term Baroque. And Baroque is a big umbrella term that art historians made up that identifies some common characteristics between a lot of different painters during this time period, but by no means are all painters doing exactly the same things. Here are some general characteristics of Baroque art, and not every work of art that we're going to look at today has every single one of these characteristics, but there are some common threads. The best way to think about Baroque art is by setting it up in contrast to what came before it, that being Renaissance art, especially the Renaissance art that was made in Italy, which tended to have this sort of Greek rational quality to it. It was tended to be calm and tended to be intellectual. Think of Raphael's School of Athens. Here is a group of philosophers and mathematicians who are debating and talking. They're not really doing things. They're sort of standing and sitting around talking. And a lot of Renaissance art, especially in Italy, is going to have that quality, a quality of the mind, a certain calmness and order and rationality. And indeed, if you think about how many works of the Italian Renaissance are structured, there's this underlying kind of geometric harmony. There is a stability to many Renaissance works. Now, when we get into the 1600s and we talk about a lot of Baroque art, one of the qualities that we see is a shift away from the order and rationality of the Renaissance, and we move more into action and emotion. Baroque art does not have that aloof dignity that a lot of Renaissance art has. It is typically in the thick of the action. Look at these characteristics of Baroque art. These are all things that support that concept. For one thing, Baroque art is going to be very theatrical. Much of it is going to actually seem like frozen images from a stage play. There's a sense of drama being played out on the canvas or in the marble in front of us. Second, Baroque compositions, unlike Renaissance compositions, are going to tend to be rather diagonal. They're going to be dynamic. There's going to be things that are happening, and Baroque artists are going to be very intentional about how they are staging their compositions. They want them to be exciting. They want them to be in motion. So it's a lot less stable compositionally than Renaissance art. Third, as I've said in other ways already, it is going to be just more emotional in general. It's going to be less intellectual and more about getting you to feel things. And the tension between head and heart is one that is going to be prominent in art for a while. We'll see a couple of other movements a little later that explore that tension as well. Finally, and this is very theatrical, a lot of the lighting, especially in Baroque painting, is very dramatic. We have half of a face lit and half of it in shadow, for example. And this is going to be perhaps the most unifying factor amongst the Baroque artists working in different countries. Almost all Baroque artists do have this dramatic lighting, so look for that as we're going through some of these paintings. All right, let's get started looking at examples of Baroque art. I have to say Baroque art is some of my favorite stuff that's ever been made, so you're going to be stuck with it in this podcast. I hope you like it. I think you will. Let's look at one of my favorite painters. This is an Italian named Caravaggio. His full name is Michelangelo Merisi. He was named Caravaggio because of where he was from. And Caravaggio is the quintessential Italian Baroque painter. He is going to embody all of those theatrical Baroque characteristics that we just talked about. Let's look at this first image. This is called The Conversion of St. Paul. And let's just analyze the composition here. Notice that we have a man on the ground. This is the Apostle Paul, and he is hearing a voice. This is a story that's recorded in Scripture. Paul initially started out as a persecutor of the early church of Christians, and he was on the road to Damascus, going to Damascus, hoping to arrest some Christians, and a bright light came out of the sky and blinded him, and a voice that turned out to be the voice of Christ asked the question, "Why are you persecuting me?" And after this experience, he is blind for several days. He goes into Damascus, his sight is restored, he becomes a Christian, and goes on to become one of the great early evangelists of the Christian faith. So this painting by Caravaggio depicts the moment at which he is blinded and on the ground, sort of waving his arms around, groping around in darkness, and presumably hearing the voice of Christ. And notice that there is just sheer blackness in the background. It makes us feel like, again, we are watching a play on a stage, and it's being lit by a single spotlight. That's absolutely Baroque lighting. The horse, you can see, is being restrained by a servant who seems to be oblivious to the voice. He's pulling the horse away to keep the horse from stepping on the blinded saint. One of the qualities about Caravaggio's paintings is their intense, sort of gritty realism. Caravaggio was someone who tended to hang out in the grittier, seedier places in society. He would spend time in bars and taverns and brothels and places where gambling happened. And he tended to choose the models for his paintings from amongst the people he knew. So very often someone who might be posing for a saint might be a notorious criminal or drunkard. And this does a couple of things. First, it lends this great sense of sort of everyday reality to the models that Caravaggio uses. And the second thing it does is make him kind of scandalous during his time. Most of the people who are hiring Caravaggio to make these paintings are churches and church officials. And they are used to seeing saints like the Apostle Paul or the Virgin Mary or Christ as sort of idealized, sanitized figures. People who are clean, who have halos, and have no physical imperfections, and have no dirt under their fingernails. And Caravaggio turns all of that on its head. Even the holiest saints in his pictures have this sense of reality, of dirty reality. You feel like they actually live on this planet, and they sweat, and they have to take baths, and that sort of thing. So as a result, many of Caravaggio's commissions were rejected by the people who hired him. They were offended by the fact that these holy people are depicted in undignified ways. And this painting, The Conversion of St. Paul, is a great example of that. Instead of being an exalted saint with a halo up in heaven, here is a man on his back on the ground, sort of flailing around in the air. Another shocking aspect to this painting is the fact that the horse's rear end is kind of pointed towards the viewer, which is not a very holy, saintly looking thing to have in a religious picture like this. Let's look at some more examples of Caravaggio. I'm nuts about Caravaggio. I think he's great. I feel like there is real emotion and drama in his work. Here's our next painting, The Taking of Christ. This is Jesus being arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane, and we see soldiers taking him. We see Judas, the man who betrayed Jesus, kissing Jesus on the cheek, the sign of his betrayal. And we see a young man, presumably the Apostle John, on the far left-hand side of the picture. And you can see him running off. Scripture records the fact that all of Jesus' disciples scattered and ran away, leaving him all alone. And again, in this painting, we have that very dramatic lighting. We have the faces of these people lit pretty much by one light source coming off from the left of the picture. We have the background in utter darkness. It's totally black. Classic Caravaggio. Another picture that demonstrates this really dark background that was developed by Caravaggio is this one, called Christ at the Column. It's another scene from the life of Jesus, and this is part of his passion. He's being tied up to this post. He's about to be scourged. You can see a man in the background is holding a whip, and Christ is about to be beaten. And again, the sharp contrast of light and dark. We have a single light source. The background cast into total darkness. This is a technique known as tenebrism. Tenebrism is basically the extreme contrast of light and dark. It's sort of like extreme chiaroscuro, and we see it in not only the areas of Christ's body, the light areas that are bumped up against the dark background, but also in the shadows on his body. Notice that there's this very quick transition from the light areas on the front of his torso to the shadows on the side. And all of this is classic tenebrism. It's something basically Caravaggio invented, and it's going to be really influential on the lighting choices of Baroque painters throughout the 1600s. This next work is in the Vatican Museums, and it's one of my favorite Caravaggios among many favorites that I have. It's called The Deposition of Christ, and you can see several people surrounding the dead figure of Christ as he's being lowered into the tomb. The composition for this is definitely diagonal, which is very, very Baroque. Our eye is led from the upper right of the picture, where a mourning woman has her hands raised, down along the thigh of Christ, finally all the way down to the cloth that is draped over the stone that projects into really into our space as the viewer. You can see the corner of that stone sort of sticking out towards us. Definitely see this painting if you go to Rome. It's huge, it's dramatic, and really, really impressive. Here's another great work by Caravaggio, The Incredulity of St. Thomas. This depicts the scene from the Gospels in which Thomas, who can't quite believe that Jesus has been resurrected from the dead, says that he won't believe it happened until he actually sticks his finger in the holes on Jesus' hands and feet and side. So here Jesus has appeared after his resurrection, and he is guiding the hand of Thomas into the wound on his side. Now this painting just really depicts how Caravaggio was true to life, and also how he did not shy away from making his holy people kind of dirty. Look at Thomas's thumbnail. There's dirt under it. Look at how the skin on the wound of Christ kind of parts as the finger pushes into his side. We feel like this is a Christ that has a real corporeal body, that he has substance to him. And that's one of the great things about Caravaggio, the reality of his figures. Here's our last Caravaggio work. Sadly, we must look at some other things in this podcast. I could really talk about him the entire time. This is the Crucifixion of St. Peter. Again, Baroque lighting, diagonal composition. It depicts the aged saint being crucified upside down. There's a tradition that Peter requested to be martyred by being crucified upside down because he did not consider himself worthy to be crucified in the same manner as Jesus. So here are three men who are helping raise the cross into position as Peter kind of pushes up off of it and looks into the distance. A lot of great details in this painting. We see the spikes going through his hands and his feet. We see the man on the bottom who has dirty feet. You can see that. Reminds us of the dirty fingernails in the painting we just saw. The shovel in his hands for digging the hole that the cross will go in. All these wonderful little details that give this painting the air of reality. Here is a work by one of Caravaggio's countrymen, another Italian named Bernini. And Bernini was kind of a Renaissance man after the Renaissance. He was a sculptor, an architect, a painter. He could pretty much do it all. But he's most known for his sculptures. He is someone who decorated Rome with many, many carved marble sculptures. You go into the Vatican, into St. Peter's Basilica, and you can see a lot of really impressive figures by Bernini all over the place. So he has left his indelible stamp all over the city of Rome. This is one of his most famous sculptures. This is David, the hero from the Old Testament. We've already seen a couple of David sculptures from the Renaissance, but Bernini is going to put a Baroque spin on this well-traveled subject. Here is David in action. He is whirling his slingshot around, about to sling the stone at Goliath. And notice all the aspects of this sculpture that are kind of similar to what we saw in Caravaggio's work. A diagonal composition, an emphasis on action. There is also more emotion in this sculpture than what we have seen in previous versions of David, in Donatello's and Michelangelo's David. Just looking at his face, as we see in these two images, you can tell there's a lot more emotion and kind of acting going on in this sculpture than what we've seen before. He has an intensely furrowed brow, and he's biting his lower lip in concentration as he's preparing to whirl the stone at the giant Goliath. This is classic Baroque. Instead of showing the aftermath of the action, like we see with Donatello, or right before the action, like we see with Michelangelo, Bernini, as a good Baroque artist, is going to actually show us the event, no holds barred. We actually see the drama unfolding in front of us. This next slide compares Bernini's and Michelangelo's David, and this is such a great little snapshot into the differences between the Renaissance and Baroque eras. Remember, Michelangelo's David has a certain calmness to it. David is preparing to act, and he is sort of gathering energy. He's concentrating, but it's a little bit more intellectual, a little more aloof. And Bernini's is in the thick of the action. Just magnificent. Here is another super famous sculpture of Bernini's, and I would be a terrible grand tour guide if I did not take you to this sculpture. It's called the Ecstasy of St. Teresa. And in this first image, we see the sculpture in the middle of this environment that consists of columns, a recess in the wall. We see these rays streaming down from the sky. These are actually bronze rays that are intended to look like sunlight. There's a window above that has yellow glass in it that allows sunlight to come in. Here we see Bernini is basically a set designer, creating this great work of theater where the set and the props and the costumes are all in place, all intended to sort of maximize the emotional effect. This is a sculpture of a mystic, Teresa of Avila, and she supposedly had this vision in which an angel appeared and had this dart or spear, and he pierced her side with it, and in that piercing she experienced this mixture of joy and pain that was very much spiritual and physical, all wrapped up together. And it was an experience of Christ's love for her, which is kind of maybe strange to our ears, but it was sort of an arrow of Christ's love that pierced her side. And after this experience, she felt deeply moved with love towards Jesus, and for her, it was all worth it. So this sculpture actually depicts her vision in a very dramatic way. Here's a close-up of the sculpture itself. Saint Teresa is floating on this cloud sort of thing, and the way Bernini staged it, being just such a theatrical guy, it seems like the cloud is floating in space. We don't really see a pedestal underneath it. Her robes are sort of flapping around as if wind is kind of sort of blowing through this sculpture. The angel has this gentle smile on his face as he draws his hand back to stick her with the arrow, and her face has this expression of ecstasy on it. Her eyes are closed and her head is thrown back and her mouth is open as she experiences this spiritual vision. When I look at this sculpture, one of the things it reminds me of is how great Bernini is at drapery. He makes it almost seem like these figures are not carved out of rock, as if he is actually manipulating real fabric. Just super, super impressive. So go to St. Peter's and see some of the figures. I remember, I think there's a skeleton holding an hourglass, and it's surrounded by all of this drapery, all carved by Bernini. Just amazing. This next image is in sort of a body of really impressive work. This, to my mind, is Bernini's most impressive sculpture. It's called Apollo and Daphne. It's at the Borghese Museum in Rome. I really want you to go see this sculpture. It's really amazing. It depicts Apollo, the sun god, who had been shot with one of Cupid's arrows and made to fall in love with a nymph named Daphne. And Daphne was not interested in being Mrs. Apollo, so she ran from him. And as she was running, as Apollo caught up with her, she prayed to her father to change her form, and he changed her into a tree so that Apollo would not be able to get her. And Bernini has depicted the moment at which the transformation has started. Again, he loves action, he loves theater, and he wants to show those moments of transformation, the height of the drama. So here, her feet are getting planted in the ground, the bark is spreading up her body, up her legs. There are leaves sprouting from her fingers. And this is just the moment that Apollo catches her, but it's too late. But look technically at this sculpture, how amazing it is, how this drapery flows out behind Apollo. And look at all the holes that are in this sculpture. Keep in mind, it was carved out of a solid piece of marble, which makes the feat all that more impressive. I remember seeing the sculpture in Rome, and if you look at some of the leaves that are coming from her fingers, some of them are carved so thin that they are translucent. You can actually see light shining through them. And to my mind, no other Bernini sculpture shows off his skill as does Apollo and Daphne. All right, let's look at some Baroque works in places outside of Italy. Let's go up to Flanders, where one of the greatest Flemish painters was Peter Paul Rubens. He does a lot of religious subjects. Here is one of his most famous. As we look at some of these other works, by the way, I want you to think about the common threads they all have, how they have these theatrical qualities that are so Baroque. Here is Rubens' Elevation of the Cross. It's a triptych. It is an altarpiece consisting of 3 panels, and in the middle we have Jesus nailed to the cross being raised into position. Now compare this to the Crucifixion of St. Peter by Caravaggio, and both of them are crosses being raised into position, but Rubens takes it up a notch. While Caravaggio had only 3 men taking care of that crucifixion, here is a whole host, a whole crowd of thugs and ruffians that are raising the cross into position. The composition is completely diagonal as our eyes follow the line of the cross from the upper left to the lower right. And really there are more people here probably than would be necessary to raise this cross into place. But Rubens is kind of relishing the drama of the scene. And the more figures you have in here, the more exciting it is. And really all of these people are actors sort of acting out this scene. In the left-hand panel, we have pious people who are lamenting the crucifixion of Christ. And on the right-hand panel, we have the realm of the soldiers who are ordering this crucifixion. We have one of the criminals being brought in from the background to be crucified alongside Jesus. Here is another religious altarpiece by Rubens, Descent from the Cross, wherein Christ's body is being brought down after he died. And again, a diagonal composition, again very Baroque lighting with strong lights on the white sheet in the body of Christ and a pretty dark background. And like the Elevation of the Cross painting that we just saw, we have a whole lot of people gathered around here, probably more than we would actually need, but it heightens the drama. Here is one of Rubens' non-religious subjects. This is called The Arrival of Marie de Medici at Marseille. This is part of a massive series of paintings, a 21 painting cycle, all of which were commissioned by the woman who is in this painting, Marie de Medici. She was the Queen of France. She was originally from Florence. She was Italian, part of the Medici family, and she was married to the King of France. And so here she is arriving on her ship, actually in France for the first time, having married the King of France. Now, Marie de Medici was not a great ruler. She wasn't very smart or competent, and she didn't do a lot of great things in her life. She did like to spend money, though, and she knew about Rubens and hired him to basically commemorate her life in this massive series of paintings. Now, if you don't have a very exciting or noble or impressive life, that means the most trivial things end up being depicted on canvas, and Rubens pulls out all the stops and makes even boring events in the Queen's life, such as walking off of the ship onto the mainland, a really exciting thing. And we see that in this painting. Marie is the woman in the dress walking down the gangplank. She is being greeted by a man in a blue robe who is an allegorical symbol of France. You can see the fleur-de-lis, the symbol of France, repeated all over his robe. Overhead, some sort of angel or allegorical figure is blowing trumpets announcing Marie's arrival. And down in the water, in a strange mixture of all kinds of pagan and Christian symbolism, we have King Neptune, the god of the sea, watching this event. And we have 3 mermaids who are splashing around in the water, and there's a dude blowing on a shell. So the theater and the drama of this boring event have been ramped up to the max. And that is a very Baroque thing. It's all about the theater, it's all about the drama. Look at this detail of Poseidon and the mermaids. This is so Rubens. One of the things that Rubens is known for is painting sort of voluptuous, full-bodied women. In fact, he enjoyed doing this so much, you can see lots and lots of skin in Rubens' paintings. And he did this so frequently that the term Rubenesque has entered our language, describing any sort of voluptuous, full-figured or full-bodied woman. So he kind of lends his name to that. And the funny thing about this painting is the mermaids kind of steal the show. You almost lose the queen in the midst of all this activity. I should mention too that something I like about Rubenesque women and something I like about art in general is that I think it gives us snapshots of different conceptions of beauty throughout the ages. And I think that is a healthy, refreshing thing to look at. Back in Rubens' day, the way these mermaids look is the standard, the ideal of what feminine beauty should be. More full-bodied than what we might think of today as the ideal that is perpetuated by runway models and movie stars. And I just think that's a good, healthy corrective, that being ultra skinny is not the last word in beauty, that all sorts of body styles can be beautiful and acceptable. And I think that's one of the great things that art history teaches us. All right, let's jump over to the Netherlands and look at the works of one of the greatest painters who ever lived, a guy named Rembrandt. And Rembrandt, although he doesn't have all of the action that Bernini and Rubens have in their pictures, he definitely has that Baroque lighting. He loves that contrast of light and dark. In fact, Rembrandt's teacher probably went down to Italy and studied with Caravaggio and kind of brought back some of Caravaggio's tenebrism up to the Netherlands, where Rembrandt picked some of it up. Let's look at just a brief sampling of Rembrandt's work. This first painting, The Anatomy Lesson of Dr. Tulp, shows a famous surgeon, Dr. Nicholas Tulp, who is dissecting a cadaver, and as he's doing that, he's lecturing about it. Back in the day, medical lectures were sort of an official public event where an esteemed doctor would discourse at length upon anatomy and physiology. So these are all medical students who have come to learn from this guy. And look at how they dress. That's pretty sweet for doctors. Huge ruffled collars and that sort of thing. No hospital gowns and no gloves here. So Dr. Tulp is explaining some of the anatomy of the arm on this figure, and look at all the faces sort of in this pool of light, and the edges of the picture fall off into shadow. The corpse itself is mostly lit. Its feet are in shadows and the top of its head are in shadows. By the way, this corpse is actually a famous criminal who had been strangled or hanged earlier that day and then made available to Dr. Tulp. That's kind of interesting. This next work by Rembrandt, painted exactly 10 years later, the company of Captain Frans Banning-Koch, more popularly known as the Night Watch. Now this depicts some armed militiamen who are going out on one of their patrols, and you can see all sorts of exciting things. You see guns and pikes, and there's a guy with a drum over on the right-hand side. So these are some real troopers heading out to do their job. And this painting has been given the nickname The Night Watch because for years it was believed that this was a scene taking place at night. The painting was covered in varnish and had a lot of soot and stuff on it, and people assumed that this armed company was going out in the middle of the night. It's actually a day scene. They are kind of walking through a courtyard between some buildings, and there's a shaft of sunlight that is falling upon their faces. So I can understand why people would think this was a night scene, but it's actually taking place during the day. Now, you can see full-fledged Baroque lighting at work here. Rembrandt is not going as flat black with his backgrounds as Caravaggio. Caravaggio tends to have very shallow backgrounds where you can't see very far into the distance. And in this painting, you can't see super far either, but you can see further than Caravaggio's backgrounds. So Rembrandt had the Baroque lighting thing down to a T, but there's more to Rembrandt than that. People love Rembrandt because they feel that above all other Baroque painters and above many painters who have even lived since Rembrandt, he had this really penetrating insight into the human condition, and that he was actually able to paint sort of the inner psychology of people. He was able to portray emotion at a really deep level. And you see that in a lot of his figures. This next image is one of his scenes from the Bible. Rembrandt painted a lot of biblical scenes. He lived in Amsterdam, and a lot of his models are actually from the Jewish section of Amsterdam. So anytime he wanted to depict an actual Jewish hero from the Bible, he had some ethnically authentic looking models to choose from. Okay, so back to this painting. This is called Return of the Prodigal Son. It depicts a story from the New Testament where Jesus tells us of a man who had two sons, and the younger one wanted to leave home before it was his time to leave home, and he asked his father for half of his inheritance, which his father gave to him. So this young man leaves home, and he wastes all of his money on wine and women, and he's broke very soon, and he has to take a job feeding pigs. And as he's feeding his pigs, he realizes this is really terrible. I'm such an idiot. I was much better back at my father's house. So he decides to go back to his father's house and humble himself before his father and say, "Father, I'm not worthy to be one of your servants. Please give me just a very low place in your household." But of course, if you've read the story, as he's coming back to see his father's been watching for him, and his father runs and greets him. And his father throws a party for this son because he's so happy that his son has come back, and he dresses him in the finest clothes. So Jesus tells this story as an allegory of God's love for us and how God always wants us to come back to him. And there's a lot of emotion and a lot of tenderness in the original parable, the original story that Jesus tells. And I feel that Rembrandt really captures this in his painting. Here we see the prodigal son, the son who wasted all his money. He's returned to his father, and it's almost like he's collapsed before his father. He's on his knees, and his head sinks into his father's chest. And as if he can't bear to look at his father, he's so repentant and so remorseful. And you can see the years of being away from his dad have not treated him well. One of his shoes is wearing thin, and the other has come off of his foot. And he's basically dressed in rags. He has a shaved head. But his father still loves his son and closes his eyes and gently puts his hands on his son's shoulders. And the father's cloak sort of wraps around his shoulders, and he almost looks like a mother hen sort of taking in one of her chicks, which is kind of cool. Over on the right-hand side of the painting, we see the older brother of the prodigal son, and who, unlike the father's expression of openness, has his hands clasped to him. He is not ready to extend the warm welcome that his father is extending. So Baroque lighting, again, the father, one of the most important characters in this painting, has light striking his face, and there's a really dark background behind him. There's a tenderness to this painting. There's a gentleness. There's real emotion here, and I think that Rembrandt has captured the heart of this wonderful story from Scripture. And now a few details about Rembrandt's life. At a young age, he was very successful. His talent was recognized from early on, and he actually made a good living painting, which is sometimes unusual for some of these artists we're going to study. He had wealth, but he wasn't a very good manager of his wealth. He tended to blow a lot of his money without saving it. One of the things that he liked to do was collect art, and that's what he spent a lot of his money on. And unfortunately, you can't eat art, so sometimes he would fall on hard times, and he wouldn't have money saved up. He was also someone who experienced a lot of tragedy in his life. His first wife, Saskia, who was really dear to him, died at a pretty young age. He also lost three of his children when they were very, very young. And he had one son who grew up to adulthood, and he actually outlived that son as well. After his wife died, he had sort of a common law wife who lived with him. He ended up committing her to an asylum, and then he had another kind of mistress who came in and lived with him. So a lot of personal turmoil in his life, and someone who experienced a lot of life's hardships. And I have a sense that really comes out in his paintings. During the times when business was slow, one of the things that Rembrandt did was paint self-portraits. He would set up a mirror and paint pictures of himself because remember, if you're an artist, it's free to paint yourself. You don't have to pay a model to pose for you. So that's what he did. And I think one of the reasons people like Rembrandt so much is people feel like they know him through his self-portraits. Folks feel like they can look into his eyes and get a sense of where he's at in life. So I want to walk through several of Rembrandt's self-portraits and kind of explore how maybe they reflect the time that he's living in and the age that he is. Here's a really early one from 1629. He's a young man, confident, successful, very Baroque lighting. Half of the face is in light, half of it's in shadow. In this next work, we have Rembrandt painting himself as the prodigal son. This is a self-portrait, and there he is, living it up in a bar. He has a woman on his lap, presumably some young strumpet or prostitute, and it's almost as if we've walked into the scene, and he is raising his glass to us, inviting us to join him at his table. The woman in his lap is actually a portrait of his first wife, Saskia. So in this image, we have a sense of a man who is prosperous, who is young, who is living it up, and who is seizing the day. In this next portrait from 1640, Rembrandt has mellowed out some. He is not partying, but we have a sense that he is more dignified, that he is dressed nicely, that he's prosperous, and he has achieved a certain level of success in his life. Jump ahead 19 years, and we see Rembrandt's self-portrait showing a man who is not dressed quite so nice. His clothes are a little simpler and shabbier. His face is more worn. Compare this to the very first image we saw, this sort of fresh-faced young man looking out with a bright future. In this portrait, we see an image of a man who has seen a lot of hardship in life, and that seems to be reflected in his face, in his eyes, in his furrowed brow. He is worried, he is grieved, and Rembrandt unflinchingly seems to record all of this in his paintings. He doesn't idealize, he doesn't make himself younger or nobler or braver than he actually is. He seems to be simply telling the truth in these works. And that's one of the reasons people love Rembrandt so much. He is a quintessential truth teller. Here's a portrait of Rembrandt in 1660. This is a very working class kind of picture. He is holding his palette and his brushes, and he's in front of a canvas on an easel, looking even older and kind of more ragged out. He almost seems to be saying, I'm getting close to the end, and my life's work has been painting, and I want to make sure I have a picture of myself actually painting. And here's one of his last self-portrait paintings 9 years later, and has this sublime sort of calmness about it. Again, here's a man who has been kind of worn down by life, but there's a certain peace to this picture that's really wonderful. Now, so we don't end on a totally depressing note with Rembrandt, here is a picture from one of his younger days. It's actually what's called an etching, which is a type of printmaking process where you take a needle and you scratch into a metal plate, and you use that plate, you ink it up, and you make prints off of that. So here's a self-portrait of him with a goofy expression on his face, wearing a hat. Just marvelous. What I love about this is it reminds us that artists who are dead and gone were people just like us, and they could be kind of crazy and goofy. It's just so human and so wonderful. And that's one of the things I absolutely love about Rembrandt. His sheer unflinching humanity. He paints real people, not idealized people. And he is, I think, forever famous for that very reason. Let's look at the work of one of Rembrandt's countrymen, a fellow Dutchman named Jan Vermeer. Vermeer is a marvelous painter, kind of like Rembrandt. He's not into a lot of action. What identifies him as a Baroque painter is his sense of dramatic lighting, which he certainly exhibits in his work. Vermeer is someone who kind of paints the same thing over and over again. Something he specializes in is basically interior scenes. Usually we are inside the room of a house and there is a person doing some sort of simple domestic activity. We'll see some examples of those. And almost always there is a window on the left that is letting light shine in, illuminating the scene. And it's almost sort of this cookie cutter template he uses again and again in his paintings, sort of a generic composition. But he's so good at it. He is such a good colorist. His colors are rich and vibrant. He's known for using extremely expensive pigments and painting very slowly and sparing no expense. So Vermeer is someone who is not just a factory cranking out work and doesn't care about quality. He is someone who apparently lovingly lavishes lots and lots of time on every painting. So let's look at some of his work. And again, I think you'll pretty quickly see sort of his standard composition that he uses again and again. Here is The Milkmaid. A woman pours milk into a bowl, and we see the light coming in from the window on the side. But look at the richness of color. Compare this to Rembrandt. Rembrandt's kind of a brown painter, lots of browns and grays. Vermeer is going to have these much more saturated, brilliant blues and yellows, both of which we see in this painting. Woman holding a balance. You can see, again, a domestic activity being performed in an interior. The window is a little more shaded here, but it's offering enough light to strike her face and giving us some awesome sort of Baroque kind of values going on here. This woman is holding a little scale with which she can test whether or not gold is authentic. And again, the composition appears in this next painting, Woman with a Water Jug. This woman is actually opening the window to let in more light. Now, look at this detail, our next slide, and you see just the richness of Vermeer's colors and also his commitment to optical fidelity or truth. We have the tablecloth, the patterned tablecloth reflecting into the shiny basin. We have the blue cloth over on the right creating a streak of blue reflecting in the little pitcher that she has, the water jug itself. Vermeer just loved color, and if you like color, he is your Baroque painter. He's really great. Here is his famous girl with a pearl earring. This is very much Caravaggio sort of lighting. Strong tenebrism. The light side of her face is bumped up against a flat, dark background. And yes, this is the painting that inspired the novel from which a movie was made with Scarlett Johansson in it. So this is, I guess, Scarlett sort of here, the character she played. And this girl, it's a wonderful, spontaneous little painting. This girl kind of looks over her shoulder at us, and she has this awesome kind of headdress. Again, the blues and the yellows. A little just blot or dab of paint on that highlight on the earring. Vermeer is a master of light and color. Here's his woman with the red hat. Another woman sort of looking over her shoulder at us as if we just walked into the room. There is a lively spontaneity and informality about this, but look at the rich, saturated color. Vermeer did not finish just a whole lot of paintings in his life compared to other artists. He tended to have more financial trouble than some other artists, perhaps because his output wasn't that prolific, but what an output it was. Just magnificent. Jewel-like colors glistening on these canvases. Now, we're going to wrap up our examination of Baroque art by looking at an artist who was not a Baroque artist. He actually didn't even live in the 1600s. He's a 20th century painter named Han van Meegeren. And the reason we're discussing him is that he was one of the greatest forgers of paintings in all of art history. And he specialized in forging Vermeer paintings. Here's a picture of him. He was Dutch, like Vermeer, and early on he had a decently okay career as a painter. He wasn't awful. He specialized in portraits, but he never really liked avant-garde painting. He didn't like the early experiments in abstraction that were happening in the early 20th century. He felt much more of a kinship with some of the old masters, especially Vermeer. And some of von Meegeren's works were blasted by critics. They said he was just a hack painter, he wasn't in touch with the spirit of his times, and he wasn't very original. So he was stung by this criticism, and he decided to set out and prove to the critics once and for all that he was a really awesome painter. And he did this by creating forgeries. He chose as his primary subject for his forgeries Vermeer as his painter that he wanted to imitate. And Vermeer is great because, as we mentioned earlier, Vermeer has these kind of cookie cutter compositions. So that gave von Meegeren a starting point. Do interior scenes with light coming in from one side, that sort of thing. And also he decided to copy early Vermeers. He wasn't quite good enough to forge later Vermeers. So he created his own original compositions that seemed very Vermeer-like, the sort of thing Vermeer might have painted starting out. And he actually used authentic materials. He used exactly the same pigments Vermeer would have incorporated into his canvases. He also purchased 17th century paintings, and he would sand off the original image, and then he would paint his forgery on top of this canvas, so the materials really seemed old. He would actually put special finishes on the paintings when he was finished with them, and he would bake them in an oven to make them crack, and then he would rub ink into the cracks to make them seem like they were really, really old. So von Meegeren showed off these paintings. He brought them to the attention of an art collector and said, "Hey, I found these Vermeers. How cool is that?" And the collector was really impressed with these paintings. He had art historians and conservators look at them, and they were thrilled. They said, "These are authentic Vermeer paintings. They are great early masterpieces from this wonderful Baroque painter and worth a lot of money." So that was great for von Meegeren, and any time he needed more cash, he would crank out a new fake Vermeer and sell it. Now, all was going well for this forger. He at least had the satisfaction of sticking it to the critics, at least in his own mind, proving his worth as a painter by copying one of the greatest painters, the style of one of the greatest painters of his homeland. All was going well until World War II. And during this time, as you may know, the Nazis swept through Europe and they gobbled up art treasures. They stole and bought some of the greatest works of European art, and many of these they brought back to Germany because Hitler wanted to create his own art museum in his hometown of Linz. And so the Germans were stashing away thousands and thousands of sculptures and paintings. And one of Van Meegeren's fake Vermeer paintings ended up in the collection of a top Nazi official, Hermann Goering, the head of the German Air Force. And after the war, the Allies were going through all of this stolen and purchased artwork and trying to return it to the original owners in the places that it had come from. And it found this Vermeer in the collection of Hermann Goering and traced it back to von Meegeren. The records showed that he had sold this to the Nazi leader. And this is really problematic for von Meegeren because during this time, anyone who had been a collaborator with the Nazis, who had helped them in any way, could be put on trial. And the worst possible penalty was death. So von Meegeren was arrested, and he was put on trial for having sold the Nazis a painting of, in a sense, betraying his own country's cultural heritage. And at his trial, von Meegeren emerged with the most outrageous defense. He said, "No, in fact, I did not collaborate with the Nazis. In fact, I pulled one over on them and ripped them off because these are not even original Vermeers. These are forgeries that I have painted." And people couldn't believe him. They said, whatever. Art historians have proved that these Vermeer paintings, and this particular one in Goering's collection, are authentic. And von Meegeren said, "I will prove it to you. I will paint a new Vermeer." And so von Meegeren, under guard, locked himself in his studio and literally painted for his life. In this picture, we see Vermeer working on the painting that was to essentially be his defense and save his life for the trial. And sure enough, he finished it on time. He did his special process where he baked it and cracked it. And he proved his innocence of collaboration, at least from a certain point of view. And he was just given, I think, 1 year in prison, and he died shortly thereafter. So when I think of Vermeer, I always think of Hans von Meegeren, the greatest forger in art history, and certainly the most popular forger of Vermeers. Kind of an interesting note to end this study of Baroque art on.